Master Washington, I am less than pleased with the paltry results coming from the colonies. I have other agents around the globe searching tirelessly for pieces of Eden, and you and your motley crew are busy building a postal service. What is more, I understand that an assassin brotherhood has taken root somewhere outside of New York. This simply will not do. Hello, and welcome to Visions of the Past. My name is Andrew, and I am the host of this Assassin's Creed lore podcast. This is episode 28, and today we're going to talk about the group that Reginald Birch was talking about in his letter, the Colonial Rite of the Templar Order. The first thing that must be discussed when talking about the Colonial Rite of the Templar Order is to establish the area in which they operated. Today, we're going to talk about the Templar activities in North America, predominantly within the area that would be controlled by the Colonial Rite, except for the area that was under the control of the Louisiana Rite before it collapsed in 1777. Now that we have an idea of what exactly we are talking about, we now need to look at where we can find the information on their activities. They were first introduced in Assassin's Creed 3 and appeared in Assassin's Creed Rogue, along with being in the self-titled Assassin's Creed comic series and the novel Assassin's Creed Forsaken. By the 1500s, both the Templars and the Assassins had some presence in the area, but it wasn't until 1692 when we see the first confirmed Templar activity on the North American continent. This was when Templars Samuel Parris and William Stoughton started the Salem witch hunt to find Piece of Eden. After discovering that the assassins Tom Stoddard and Jennifer Query had also come to Salem to hunt pieces of Eden, Stoughton would use the townsfolk to hunt and kill the two assassins, an idea that Parris would object to. Eventually, though, they'd catch up with the assassins in a swamp. Stoughton would allow an injured Jennifer Query to flee so they could follow her to Stoddard and to Dorothy Osborne, who was considered a seer. Thinking that Query was a traitor, Stoddard would attack her, and Stoughton would take the opportunity to tie up all three people. Stoughton would torture the assassins for information and would go so far as to threaten hurting a mute boy by the name of David. Jennifer, though, would offer to give them information, but she would take the opportunity to kill a guard and free Stoddard. This would lead to her death when Stoughton shot her. Stoddard, though, would try to free the two non-assassins when Stoughton shot him in the arm. Stoughton would then make a mistake and reveal that he had planned to experiment on the women that were captured during the witch trials, so he could attempt to replicate Dorothy's ability. This information would cause Dorothy to commit suicide. When Stoughton threatened to kill Stoddard, Samuel Parris would interfere by shooting Stoughton in both shoulders. Parris would then pull a pistol on Stoddard, stating that he would not leave any witnesses to this horror. Stoddard would confront Parris, asking him to stand down so that he may honor Dorothy's death. Parris would give Stoddard the keys to the cells so that he could take the accused women and David out, and reminded him that not all Templars should be judged the same way, and then he would declare to Stoughton that their mission was done in Salem. James Wardrop, whose family was an active Templar family in the colonies before the second half of the 17th century, would be inducted into the order in 1720 and tasked to securing land and wealth to build up the foundation for a colonial rite. In 1738, British Grand Master Reginald Birch named Lawrence Washington Master Templar of the British colonies in the New World, and would task him to find Isu locations and other relics from their civilization. By 1744, Wardrop began to build a trade network running from the American colonies to the West Indies, and in 1746, Washington would recruit the famous explorer Christopher Gist, who would in turn hire Jack Weeks as an errand boy after Weeks had attempted to pickpocket Gist, impressing him with his audacious attitude. That same year, Washington would have Gist expand the Templar communication network by recruiting William Johnson into the order. Together, they would build an infrastructure out of Johnson's networks, as he was the colonel of the Warriors of the Six Nations and had good relations with the Cananea Kahaka. The next year, Washington would work with other predominant businessmen and create the Ohio Company, with the intent on opening trade to the interior of the American continent. He would also hire Samuel Smith around this time as the treasurer of one of his businesses, an extension the Colonial Templars. In 1750, Gist and Wardrop worked to acquire land for the order by evicting many native tribes from their ancestral lands. Also within that year, Reginald Birch sent George Monroe to assist Washington in his search for Isu sites. While operating in New York, Monroe and Gist would work alongside the son of Barry and Cassidy Finnegan to renovate and rid the city of an assassin-allied gang. That year, Washington would task Gist to secure alliances and trade routes with the natives west of the colonies through the Ohio Company, and by 1751, Gist and Weeks would be officially inducted into the Templar Order. That year would also see an earthquake hit Port-au-Prince, where the Templars would take a box and a manuscript of Isu origin. These two items Washington would task the other Templars to research. They would ask allies in New York and native tribes for any information, but no one was successful. In 1752, Thomas Hickey would be stationed in Boston and would be assigned as the assistant to William Johnson, eventually joining the order himself. In July of that year, Washington would pass the two artifacts to Samuel Smith and James Wardrop before he was killed by the assassin Shea Cormac. This would lead Wardrop to take over as the head of the Templars in the colonies, while Smith traveled to Europe in an attempt to find a scientist who could make the box work. John Pitcairn would become a Templar in 1754, and after proving his worth to their cause, would use his connections within the order to have his commander, Geoffrey Amherst, arrange for him to be moved to Copp's Hill Battery in Boston so that he could assist the Templars in the colonies. By April of 1754, the British Templar Haytham Kenway would kill British assassin Miko and acquire a key to the Isu site, which Reginald Birch would send Haytham to the colonies so he could find that site. In May 1754, Samuel Smith would return to the Americas, where he would be assassinated by Shea Cormac, who would then take the Isu box from him. On July 8th, Haytham would arrive in Boston and be greeted by Charles Lee, who was himself hoping to join the order. The two men would gather 4 Templars that Reginald Birch had arranged for Haytham to recruit for his quest. These 4 men were William Johnson, Thomas Hickey, Benjamin Church, and John Pitcairn. Meeting in the Green Dragon Tavern after Haytham retrieved Johnson's research on native tribes, he concluded that the samples on the key were from the Kananiakahaka, and that they would need their help to find the site. In July, Johnson would also be present at the Albany Congress, where he would contact Benjamin Franklin to see if he could make the Isu box and manuscript work. Though Shea Cormac would assassinate James Wardrop before the manuscript could be passed along. And on July 10th, Haytham would save Benjamin Church from Silas Thatcher and his assistant, a man by the name of Cutter. After recruiting John Pitcairn 3 days later, the former Templar Edward Braddock would try to keep Pitcairn from helping Haytham, even though they were once brothers in arms. Haytham's group would then infiltrate Southgate Fort to free natives that Silas took as slaves, in an attempt to find information on the Isu site. During the fight, Church would shoot Silas in the head for retribution for holding him. On November 14, 1754, Haytham would find one of the slaves that had escaped Southgate and would promise to help the natives stop the British expeditions into their territory. Kanahideo would refuse to help without proving that she could trust him. They would then learn that the British government had arranged for Edward Braddock to lead an expedition to the French-held Fort Duquesne. In July, Haytham's group, along with some native tribes, would attack Braddock's expedition. This, along with an assault from the French army, would lead to the destruction of the expedition. Christopher Gist would be present here, as well as Lawrence Washington's younger half-brother George. Gist, being able to hold George back, led directly to the death of Edward Braddock at the hands of Haytham. After the assassination of Braddock, Kanahideo would take Haytham to the Grand Temple, though to Haytham it would look little more than a cave, because the artifact that he had would not open the door to the temple. Haytham would return to the Green Dragon Tavern and would explain to his group that the cave led to nothing, and now they needed to officially establish the Colonial Rite of the Templar Order, with him as Grand Master, to protect the temple and to induct Charles Lee into their ranks. Near the end of 1755, George Monroe's men would save Shea Cormac after he was left for dead after betraying the assassin brotherhood. On Shea, Monroe would find the Isu manuscript and was tasked by Haytham to discover its purpose. Monroe would then send Shea to recover from his wounds with the Finnegans for weeks. After Shea recovered, he would kill the leading assassin of the Greenwich Gang. This would lead George Monroe to see his potential and would convince Shea to help him rebuild New York. Christopher Gist would find that the gangs within New York were working on creating new weapons that would eventually lead to Shea saving Gist in Fort Arsenal after being captured, and then he would reclaim the fort and Shea's old ship, the Morrigan. Shortly after, Gist would become the quartermaster on the Morrigan, and along with George Monroe, they would attack Fort LaCroix because it was disturbing Monroe's operations. Here, Shea would meet and kill Le Chargé, who would tell him about the assassin's plan to poison officials of New York City. This plan Shea would eventually foil, and in 1757, Monroe would be assigned to Fort William Henry, and because of the approach of the French, would send the Issue manuscript to Shea for safekeeping, and at the same time, he revealed that he was a Templar. After the siege of Fort William Henry in August of that year, Monroe would be attacked by the Abenaki, who were led by the assassin Kasigawase. Shea would be able to save Monroe, but it would lead to Kasigawase to prepare an attack on the city of Albany. In November, Shea would arrive in Albany when the assassins attacked the city. While Shea would kill Kasigawase, another assassin would fatally wound Monroe and steal the Issue manuscript from him, and then set the building on fire that they were in. Shea would arrive to pull Monroe from the fire, but he would be too late to save Monroe's life, and with his last breath, Monroe would ask Shea to continue his work while giving Shea his Templar ring. Shea would officially be inducted into the Templar Order by Hatham Kenway in 1758, after which Shea, Hatham, and Christopher Gist would join Captain James Cook on the HMS Pembroke to help the British during the siege of Louisbourg. During the siege, the assassin Adewale would support the French with his ship, the Experto Crede, but he would flee the battle when the group of Templars decided to destroy fire ships instead of giving him chase. Not too long after the siege of Louisbourg, Shea would catch up with Adewale, forcing him to beach his ship near Vineo-Carreri and would assassinate him. In 1759, a group of assassins led by the mentor Achilles Davenport would meet in New York in an attempt to use the Issue box and manuscript to find a different temple than the Grand Temple that Hatham had already found. Shea would take the information that he had learned, overhearing this meeting, and would report back to Hatham. With the help of Jack Weeks, Shea would turn the British guards against the assassins by dressing as members of the Allied gangs and causing a ruckus around New York. This would lead to Shea spying on a pair of assassins through a window of a New York mansion. One of these assassins would shoot out the window in which Shea was standing, and it would cause him to fall and end up being poisoned. Shea would be forced to kill the assassin Hope Jensen to get the antidote, and he would learn that the assassin, and forgive me for mispronouncing his name, but he was Louis Joseph Guillotte Chevalier de la Vérendrye. He had taken the two artifacts with him. In 1760, Shea, with the help of James Cook, would find Chevalier's location near Fogo in Canada. He would board his ship, the Gerfault, and defeat him in a duel. With his last words, Chevalier revealed that he was just a diversion to be able to give Achilles time to reach the temple. In March of that year, Hatham and Shea had tracked the assassin to the precursor temple in the Arctic Ocean, and after infiltrating the camp, would try to stop them from touching the artifact that lay hidden within the temple. During an argument, the artifact would be touched, causing an earthquake, and after escaping the collapsing cave and killing his old friend Liam O'Brien, Shea would stop Hatham from killing the assassin mentor, so he could serve as a warning for the assassins as to what these kind of temples do and to not search for them. Taking this idea to heart, Hatham would settle for shooting Achilles in the knee, crippling him for the rest of his life. With the manuscript safe in hand, Hatham would charge Shea with finding the box, which he would do in 1776, retrieving it after assassinating the Parisian assassin Charles Dorian at the Palace of Versailles. Christopher Gist would be tasked by Hatham to continue the eradication of any remaining assassins in the colonies. The final push would be in an attack on the Davenport homestead in 1763, leaving only Achilles Davenport and Benjamin Talmage Sr. alive. In 1768, the Templars would set a trap for the assassin brig, the Aquila, after they had found out it had not already been destroyed. 3 British frigates would ambush the ship, nearly destroying it, but Robert Falkner would survive the trap and manage to escape. He would later return to the ship and take it back to the Davenport homestead. As tensions rose in the British colonies over taxation and a lack of representation in the British Parliament, the Templars would try to influence both sides in an attempt to achieve a less violent independence for the colonies and to create a new nation on the back of Templar ideals. William Johnson would trade with the Native Americans in order to protect them. John Pitcairn was now a major in the British Army and known as a peacekeeper, and he was respected by the citizens of Boston. Benjamin Church had joined the Sons of Liberty, all as a means to nudge the upcoming conflict into an outcome that would be best for the Templars. On March 5, 1770, a crowd would form around Boston's old State House. Hatham would seize this moment to force a riot to break out, having a soldier take a position on a nearby rooftop and fire into the crowd. This soldier would be stopped by a young Ratagahaton, but the outbreak would still happen, as Charles Lee would fire a pistol into the air. The British soldiers, positioned at the old State House, would believe it came from the crowd and would fire on the gathered people. This event would become known as the Boston Massacre, and it increased the angers of the colonists towards the British Crown. Around August that year, Benjamin Church would see to the induction of the junior officer of the British Navy, Nicholas Biddle. Biddle started to raid the coasts of Nantucket under the pretense of British ships making the region unstable in 1773. That year would also see William Johnson attempting to purchase land from the Iroquois in an attempt to protect them for when the colonists started to expand west. To finance this purchase, Johnson would have tea smuggled into Boston after the Tea Act had caused the price of tea to spike, and he would also extort the people of Boston with his tax collectors. The Tea Smuggling Act would be foiled on December 16, 1773, when a group led by the assassin Ratagahaton would unload the ships of their tea directly into Boston Harbor. On July 11, 1774, Johnson did find another way to purchase the land, and he had set up a meeting with the Kananiakahaka. This would be the meeting in which Ratagahaton would assassinate him before any deal could be struck. On April 19, 1775, John Pitcairn would go to Lexington to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock in an attempt to end the American Revolution before it could even begin by negotiating with them. The meeting between the army behind Pitcairn and the Patriots would result in the battles of Lexington and Concord, and after retreating back to Boston, the colonists would begin the siege of Boston. As the Continental Army was created, the Templars would work to place men on the rebel side. Charles Lee made an attempt to become commander-in-chief, but instead ended up second in command to George Washington. Benjamin Church would be the first Surgeon General. Thomas Hickey would end up as a member of the private guard to General Washington, and Nicholas Biddle would be the captain of the USS Randolph, the first ship of the Continental Navy. During the Battle of Bunker Hill, John Pitcairn would continue to try to negotiate peace, but he was eventually killed by the assassin Ratagahaton, believing that his goal was to assassinate Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Near the end of 1775, Benjamin Church would be arrested for passing colonial intelligence to the British. This act would also see him expelled from the Templar Order. As 1775 rolled into 1776, the Templars would start to work on a plan to assassinate George Washington. Hatham would task Thomas Hickey with Washington's death, but in June, when the assassin Ratagahaton tried to kill him, Hickey would be arrested for forgery and passing counterfeit money. While incarcerated at Bridwell Prison, Hickey and Lee would find a way to charge the murder of the prison's director on Ratagahaton, along with the conspiracy to assassinate George Washington. The next morning would see Charles Lee prepare to execute Ratagahaton, but before it could be followed through, Hatham, who at this point realized that the assassin was his son, would throw a knife, severing the rope, keeping him from hanging. In the panic, Hickey would try to assassinate Washington, but he would be stopped by the assassin that Hatham had freed. Throughout the year, the Templars continued attacking Nantucket with British ships to force the Continental Congress to give Nicholas Biddle more ships. And, using the Randolph, Biddle would be tasked to escort the French ship La Belladonna to supply the Continental Army, but instead, he would send other ships to attack her. Near the end of 1776, Charles Lee would be captured by the British Army and give information on the Continental Army in an attempt to weaken Washington's position as commander. In late 1777, Benjamin Church was liberated from his house arrest and would steal Continental Army supplies. George Washington would charge Ratagahaton to find the supplies, and during his research would find that his father Hatham was also looking for Church because of his treason against the Templar Order. The two would decide to work together to find Benjamin Church and would chase him to New York, eventually finding that it was a trap, as Church had already left on the Welcome and headed to Martinique. On March 7, 1778, Hatham and Ratagahaton would find Church off the coast of Martinique on an unnamed vessel, and after a brief naval battle, Hatham and Ratagahaton would board the ship and kill Church. 10 days later, Nicholas Biddle was patrolling the Caribbean and prepared a trap for Ratagahaton during his truce with Hatham. The Randolph, along with 2 other men of wars, would unsuccessfully attack the Aquila, and at the end of the battle, Ratagahaton would board the Randolph and kill Biddle, but he would allow him to go down with his ship. On June 17, 1778, Hatham would continue to work with Ratagahaton, learning that the British intended to launch an attack from New York. Hatham, wanting to inform Charles Lee, would end up following his son to inform George Washington at Valley Forge. During this meeting, Hatham would show Ratagahaton a letter that had an order on it from Washington to attack Ratagahaton's village, just like he had ordered the attack that had killed his mother. This revelation would lead Ratagahaton to dissolving his relationships with both Washington and Hatham. Charles Lee, though, was aware of the check and would recruit members of Ratagahaton's village, including Ratagahaton's childhood friend, Canandaigua, to fight for the British. And then, during the Battle of Monmouth, Lee would sabotage the colonial army's preparations, all leading to him being judged as a traitor and suspended from his duties as second-in-command of the colonial army. Over the next 3 years, Templars George Durrance, John Boyd, Hugh Jackson, and Johann de Kalb all would be assassinated during major battles of the American Revolution. But the biggest blow to the colonial Templars was in September 1781, when Ratagahaton would assault Fort George in New York, looking for Charles Lee, but instead, he'd be confronted by his father, Hatham. The two would fight amid the assault on Fort George. This fight would end up resulting in the death of Hatham and the rise of Charles Lee to Grand Master of the Colonial Rite of the Templar Order. In early 1782, a funeral would be held for Hatham, which was presided over by Lee, but it would be interrupted by his assassin. After having Ratagahaton retained, Lee would travel to Boston, where the two would confront each other again, and after a chase through Boston, the two would meet one last time at the Last Drink Inn in Monmouth. Here, Ratagahaton would take the Grand Temple key from Lee and assassinate him, effectively ending Templar influence in North America. The Templars of the British colonies saw a lot of ups and downs over the 100 or so years of known activities, fights with the assassins, and even some arguments between themselves, but they always found a way to bounce back. Well, at least they did until the American Revolution, when Ratagahaton effectively ended their schemes by killing his father and Charles Lee. They found Isu temples and even helped lay the backbone of colonial America. What is the most interesting to me is that the earliest Templars in the British colonies were sent to find Isu artifacts, and they did have a little success, but they found most of their success by growing the colonies, from Lawrence Washington creating the Ohio Company to their involvement in the American Revolution. Sure, we see the assassins put down individual plots, but they never fully put down the Templars, and they keep coming back to the area. The death of Lee and Kenway might have seen the end of the colonial Templar Rite, but that wouldn't be the end of the Templars in the area, but that is a podcast for another day. Thank you for joining me today. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for new episodes. If you love the Visions of the Past podcast, I'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on iTunes. If you have any questions about Assassin's Creed or topics that you would like me to cover, please feel free to hit me up on Twitter and Instagram at visions_AC, and you can find those links in the episode's show notes. Until next time, my assassin friends, make sure to follow the creed. And to those Templars listening, may the Father of Understanding guide you.